My name's Hayden. I'm a member of the Wellington Social Society. We're an affiliate branch to the New Zealand Federation of Social Societies. A warm welcome to both the newcomers here tonight, as well as our affiliate members this evening from Canterbury and Otago Social Societies, as well as my comrades back in Wellington. I miss you all. Briefly, a quick introduction. The Federation is an organisation in Aotearoa founded on simple socialist principles. Our aim is to be a political home for people with a variety of views, rather than attempting to build unity around litigation on the nature of specific revolutionary periods or state experiments, or equally niche interpretations of socialist doctrine. We instead come together around a common vision of socialism. We are a membership organization. We charge about $40 a year, and which generally just helps keep the lights on, and a twice annual production of our newsletter, the Commonweal, which is, I'm sure Michael may recognize the pattern, but this is our latest one, in the spirit of William Morris, as you can see there, Michael. He's a big influence of ours. He's our patron saint, actually. And we also have, when you sign up, you get stickers like this, and I don't have my lapel badge, but a lapel badge of our logo.
I'll have to get one of those.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I'm going to get my comrades to send over a bunch so I can start giving them out in the UK, because I gave some out in the last one, which I can actually, I've got a copy here for you as well. But by socialism, we don't mean anything very well, it's broad the way we mean it. The political goal of bringing the working class to power at all levels of society in order to establish a system where production is organized to meet human needs rather than the accumulation of private wealth. To this end, all of our affiliate organizations, Otago, Canterbury, the Mothership, and Wellington, organize, we host seminars, lectures, workshops, film screenings, and social events that are open to the public. And additionally, we have members-only events that are social, political, and organizational in scope. So if you do want to get in contact, I'll put the details in the chat, just about email addresses, and we can liaise that way. But that's enough from me. Rather than me talk too much longer, I do like to have our guests introduce themselves. So Michael Roberts, by all means, introduce yourself and we can crack into things.
Well, thank you, Hayden, and thank you, everybody, for inviting me all the way across the ether to New Zealand, as most of you are there. But as in the case with New Zealand, they're also exiles, at least temporarily. So it's great to be talking to you, because I've never had this opportunity before to discuss the situation that's happening in the world economy, and perhaps in relation to New Zealand as well. I'm rather ancient. I don't know if I'm the oldest online today, but I'm certainly very ancient. Well into my 70s. I've been an activist in the labour and socialist movement since early days, since probably in my 20s. So that's quite a long time. But perhaps more interestingly for you guys is that while being an activist, I also actually I was a trained economist at university and beyond, and I actually went into the private sector, not the public sector. So I've worked for various banks and financial institutions in the heart of the beast, as it were, for about 40 years in various organizations. So usually the question comes up, how can you possibly do that and be a socialist or Marxist, let alone, at the same time? Perhaps we can discuss that on another occasion, but basically, if you can imagine that I'm some sort of schizophrenic, then you've probably got an understanding of how it's possible to do the day job in one way, and then the rest of the time to take a different approach and activity. So, but I have concentrated in the last 25 years on developing my understanding of Marxist economics, critique of the capitalist economy, for the purposes of trying to understand it not in myself, but also to try and explain the economic trends going on in world capitalism, particularly over the last, whatever the period is, in order for us to understand the direction that capitalism is going in, because if we don't understand the objective conditions, have a view about where we're going, and particularly the economic foundations of those objective conditions, then we're going to find it difficult to, as it were, navigate our way as activists and as in the movement towards changing society. So that's been my mission, as it were, particularly in the last few decades. And as a result of that, I have written several books on the world economy, about the Great Recession of 2008-9, what I call what happened after that, the long depression of the 2010s, and more recently, books on how I see capitalism going in the 21st century. Those books sometimes being done in conjunction with Mina Carcedi, an Italian Marxist economist that I've worked with closely over the last few decades. We generally agree on the theoretical and empirical questions, and I'll perhaps come and deal with that as we go through this presentation I'm going to give you. And at the same time, as probably, hopefully most of you know, that I run a blog called Michael Roberts Blog, which puts out regular items about what's happening in the world economy and looks not just at day-to-day issues, but also at more theoretical ones for socialist and Marxist economics. And I run a Facebook site as well, which almost does daily items on what's happening in the world. So that's me for the moment. And so it's kind of you to ask me to make my presentation. So well, I'll do that by, the subject was Capital After COVID, quite a good title. So I've taken that up, and in my, I'm going to share some graphs now, which I usually do, and hopefully this will help the rest of you see that. I'm not able to do that at the moment, Hayden. Host disabled.
Yeah, I'll quickly share it to Tom. Tom, is there a way to unlock that from your end?
I think I'm clear now. Let's have a look. Yeah, here we go.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
God, he's quick. Ah, that's magic. Thanks, Tom.
Oops, let's go back up. Okay, so here we go. So Capital After COVID, which you kindly presented as the title, which was a good one, I thought, and an excellent picture. So let's start then with COVID and with the pandemic itself. Remind ourselves that back in as a result of the COVID pandemic, which spread across the world in 2020 onwards, it's now estimated that something like 20 million life years were lost to COVID during that period, and 120 million years, if you want to measure it in terms of extra poverty caused around by the world as a result of that. And that, as it's been mentioned by various experts on this, that the poverty consequences of the pandemic should be given as much importance as the deaths, but the deaths have been big. Here is the cumulative damage, at least according to the World Health Organization, more or less up to date at the moment. And the best measure of this is not the number of COVID cases or deaths from COVID, but the excess deaths over and above the general average of deaths in the world during the period from beginning of 2020 are more or less to date. Just for your morbid information, approximately 55 million people die every year. So what we're talking about here is the level of deaths above that average of, say, approximately 55 million. And it's estimated, as far as we can tell, that excess deaths probably from COVID or from complications caused by COVID, so people already having complications, suffering as a result of also getting COVID, has led to about 20 million people dying over that period of time. That's way more than the actual confirmed number. But it's a staggeringly terrible result for humanity as a result of the spread of this pandemic. And I can't go into why the pandemic had this bad result, because that's another matter. Of course, we're talking about the period afterwards. But the biggest hit, of course, economically, was a huge slump in all the world economies. 90% of the countries in the world suffered a slump or recession. That means a fall in the national output of the economy. So in other words, instead of just slowing down, there was actually a fall in the national income created or produced by the people in that economy. And you can see on this graph here that this is measured by the United Nations Trade and Development Organization, UNCTAD, that if you're starting in 2019 at 100, basically the world output dropped by about 4% or a little bit more than 4% during 2020. That's the biggest drop in the history of capitalism in any one year since capitalism really got going, and also the widest distribution of that collapse in production. As we know, this is basically caused by lockdowns across the world, closure, the reduction dramatically of manufacturing production, of international trade because of the restrictions being placed on international movement of people and so on. So there was a massive drop in production and output. That slump, however, was a fairly short one, unlike the Great Recession of 2008-9, which was the previous largest one, which lasted much longer, at least 18 months, if not 2 years. Within a year, world output was more or less back to where it was in 2019, as you can see there. But you'll notice that the trajectory of recovery has not meant we've gone from 95.7, if you can see on this graph, up towards where the previous position was with the growth rate of the world then. We're on a lower trajectory than we were before the pandemic. So the pandemic recovery has been weaker. It's not changed, led back to getting the economies of the world back on a front that they were before 2019, which is, by the way, also very weak. It's now even weaker in its recovery. And one of the big things that came out of the end of the pandemic and the slump, and when the recovery took place, was a dramatic increase in the inflation of prices across the world. Average prices rising by anything between, in most countries, some are even way worse than that, but between 8 to 10% in 1 year. We hadn't seen inflation rates like that, very high inflation rates, for something like 50 years, since the 1970s. And 3/4 of countries experienced inflation rates above 6% in 2022. This is the most prevalent global inflation since 2008, but actually even higher because it's lasted so much longer. The question we have to ask ourselves then is, why did this inflation come about? Well, it becomes pretty clear, having looked at the evidence, that the main reason was a complete inability of production and supply, and the supply side, to recover sufficiently to meet the needs of people when the lockdowns were over and people started going to work and spending again. That there wasn't sufficient return to response from the supply side of the economy. It wasn't due to wages being driven up or excessive demand from government spending, but primarily due to the collapse in supply blockages across the world. Rose, manufacturing didn't pick up, productivity was low. And that's quite important. But I think it's also worth remembering that what we mean by inflation the rise in prices. And if we look at what happened, it's not the same as the level of prices, but it's the change in prices. So now as we enter 2024 and have had a year in 2023 when inflation rates have come down, all we're saying is that the change in prices, the rate of change in prices, has been slowing. But the level of prices are still rising. For example, if you assume that we're at 100 for the price level, if prices rise by 10% in 1 year, then at the end of that year, prices are now 110. In the next year, if prices rise only by 5%, so inflation rates have been halved, and governments like to tell us how they've managed to get inflation rates halved. Inflation is slow, but the price level compared to the original price level, 100, is now 115 plus. So we've still got a much higher level of prices for people to try and pay for their goods and services. And if you go into a third year, say the inflation slows only to 2%, which is targets of what central banks and other governments try to set for inflation, then at the end of that third year, the price level is now close to 118 rather than 100. So although inflation has been slowing, price levels are now nearly 18% higher after 3 years. And these figures that I present to you here, which is a model, are pretty much close to the reality, that across the board in the major economies, the prices are something like 18 to 20% higher at the end of 2023 than they were at the beginning of 2020. And that's a huge increase in the cost of living faced for the average working household to deal with over the last 3 years. Now, it's claimed by the authorities that what causes inflation is, first of all, basically when demand exceeds supply, and in particular, when workers ask for more pay rises, and that forces owners and employers and companies to raise prices in compensation to attempts by workers to get higher wages. A couple of quotes here from some of those authorities. The first one from the Bank of England governor, who says, I'm not saying nobody should get a pay rise. What I'm saying is we do need to restrain pay bargaining, otherwise it will get out of control. So we'll have a wage price spiral, is the way that Andrew Bailey put it. Jason Furman, who was a White House economist under previous Democratic administrations, sums up basically the economics, conventional economics. When wages go up, that leads to prices going up. And if airline fuel or food ingredients go up in price, then airlines have to raise their prices. Similarly, if wages for flight attendants or servers go up, then they also raise prices. This follows from basic common sense. Well, actually, it doesn't, because what's missing from this equation is profits. If wages go up, there's no reason for inflation to go up unless if profits can be reduced. But in fact, what happened during the period after the end of the pandemic was an absolute explosion in the margins that companies were making and in the profits that they were making, particularly in areas like energy and food. And if you look at these figures briefly here, you can see that in 2019, take the top line here, profits are actually falling by about 9% on a global basis. And in 2020, during the pandemic slump, they were falling by 33%. But in 2021, they rose by 81%, way more than wages did. And they continued to rise through 2022. And particularly, we can see that in the case of energy, it rose by 300% in the inflationary year of 2021. And also in various materials, we've seen massive increases in the rate of profit. And so if you've got a very sharp rise in profits, that implies two things. Firstly, that workers and households are looking to get the things that they need in order to live, but it's sort of when there's a tight position on supply and blockages in producing more, then companies are in a position where they can raise prices in order to take advantage of scarcity in supply. And so it's not so much wages that have caused the increase in inflation, but the supply blockages and the advantages taken by companies to raise prices. In particular, we've seen a rise in food prices during that period, and the profits made by a very small number of almost monopoly food trading companies have been at record highs, as you can see by the graph on the right, which takes the top major food companies, about 5 of them here, and you can see the growth in profits rates during this period in 2022 compared to the averages that we saw in 2016, 2018, etc. That's food. And of course, we know in energy, the other big boost to profits came to the huge oil and gas majors, who made record profits during 2022 and into 2023, nearly $100 billion just in the first half of 2022. And of course, more followed from that. So the ability of these big food and energy companies in international markets to boost prices was dramatic, was one of the key features which led to the rise in inflation in prices across the board for everyone. There we go. Back to the next screen. So we've got, just to sum up quickly, we've got a high inflation during 2022. We haven't seen that before. This is a result of supply chain blockages and the ability of companies to hike profits in order to take advantage of that. It's not been due to any particular wage rise spiral claimed by the authorities. It's been, on the contrary, wages have been desperately trying to catch up increases with the price rises that we've seen over the last couple of years. So what we've, if we look at the wider economy, what we have a position in 2023 is what we might call stagflation. In other words, the world economy is growing at a very slow rate, yet inflation has rocketed up from something like 2 or 3% in the advanced capitalist countries before the pandemic, and say 4 or 5% in the other countries, to something like, at least in 2022, to 8 to 10% for most economies, and in 2023 still at around about 5 or 6%. And what we see now since 2021, really a growth rate which is very poor. The World Bank reckons, for example, that Asia, which includes, in this case, not just the Asian tigers, I think, but also Australia and New Zealand, we perhaps come to that a bit later, faces one of the worst economic outlooks in half a century, according to World Bank. Global trade has been falling and now is crawling up very slowly in 2024, where everybody, we've seen the major trading economies have lost exports as a result. And in particular, industrial production and manufacturing output has been very weak indeed and negative around the world at the moment. So what we used to have a position where we've got inflation still at around 5 or 6% for most economies, and we've got output in most economies now barely crawling above 1 to 2%. So it's almost a stagflationary situation. And in the opinion of UNCTAD and World Bank, this situation will continue, if not get worse. And if we look at the latest data provided by the World Bank, they're saying that the global economy is on track for its worst half decade in growth in 30 years. And you can see on the graph here on the left that in the current decade that we're in now, up until the end of this year, it's estimated that the global growth rates will be around about 2% a year. We haven't had that as bad as that since the 1990s. And actually, it'll probably be lower than that, and therefore be going to something that is hasn't been seen, I think, really in the last 50 or 60 years. So without a change in this, the 2020s, the decade we're in now, is likely to be a decade of wasted opportunity, said the World Bank's chief economist. By that, they mean that we're not going to recover in any particular way to improve the conditions of people around the world during this decade as we come away from the COVID pandemic. And that brings me to my general theoretical point I want to make to you guys about the state of the world economy and how we can look at different stages in the world economy. In my book, The Long Depression, I describe, as it were, schematically or from a model, that we are in a period which I call a long depression, which is different from just a recession. A recession is, under capitalism, takes place nearly every 8 to 10 years. For the last 150 years, that's approximately the case. Capitalism grows for about 8 years. Then it has a slump, a recession, slowdown in investment, production, and employment. It has a year or so of bad situation of that type. And then the cleansing process takes place. Capitalism then resumes some sort of growth and it continues for another half a decade or longer accordingly. But in periods of capitalism, it seems that there's been something worse than that. So if you look on the top left-hand corner, that's the typical situation which happens under capitalism, as in 1974-5, a slump in production, a recovery to the previous trend, or in 1982, where you actually have a double slump. That was rather unusually, but you return to the previous trend. But what I'm saying here, that 3 times in the history of capitalism so far, we've had what we call a depression. There's a slump, a recovery, but it doesn't return to the previous trend growth. We have lower growth now. So if you had taken that space there, that's the loss of potential growth, even from the previous growth rates as a result of the depression. You stay in this depressionary environment. And down the bottom here, you can see the reality of the situation. I think there were 3 depressions, the late 19th century one, starting in the middle of the 1870s and not really ending until the end of the 1880s. And that's an actual measure of what it was a case for the major economies in that period. And then, of course, the Great Depression of the 1930s, you can see the slump to 32, somewhat of a recovery in 37, the slump again, and really only World War established a position of return to trend growth. Now, in my view, we're in a similar depression, which began in 2008-9 after the Great Recession. We didn't get back to trend growth during the 2010s. It was a period of depression in that sense. And as we go into the 2020s, the situation seems to be a continuation of that process, if not worse. And why is this? Well, again, theoretically, if you bear with me, I'd like to argue that the reason we get the booms and slumps in the capitalist economies is down to the inability of capitalism to sustain a level of profit rate, which will enable them to continue to expand their investment, employ more workers, and produce more in a harmonious way. There is a pressure, a contradiction developing in capitalism between the drive by capitalists competing with each other to raise profitability and at the same time sustain production. Marx argued that that was not possible for capitalists when they were competing with each other, employing more machinery and raw materials relative to the only value creating part of capitalism, namely workers' effort, the value created by workers. It wasn't possible for them to maintain sufficient exploitation of worker to match the competition driving capitalists to employ more constant capital, more machinery, raw materials, and so on. So with the overall costs of employment of workers and machinery and materials would rise faster than the amount of increased exploitation that they could get out of workers. So there'd be a tendency for the profitability of total capital investment to fall over time. And Marx regarded this as a very important law of modern political economy because it explained booms and slumps, that when profitability fell to a certain point, profits also started to fall, and then you would get a slump, and then capitalism would have to close down various weaker companies, lay off workers, try to reduce costs before they could begin to start production again with a new level of profitability achieved by doing those measures in a slump. So that law applies to recessions. What I found in the period of the 2010s and onwards is that profitability of capital has not been restored by the slumps that we've seen in the Great Recession of 2008-9, or for that matter, in the pandemic slump. We appear to be, capitalism is finding it difficult to restore the level of profitability that it's had in the past, and therefore there is no incentive to really raise investment and employ more people at reasonable wages, and therefore establish faster growth rates in production. And at the same time, we've seen a significant transfer of value and profit from the dominated countries of the so-called global south, the periphery in the world, to the imperialist countries in a number of ways. So through trade, through the repatriation of profits by multinational companies, there's been capitalism in the major economies have attempted to raise profitability and compensate for this depressionary environment by increasing their exploitation of the global south and the periphery. And there's been a big transfer of surplus value through international trade, through repatriation of profits. Different estimates of how much that is, but some people say, and our own work, Munich and myself, is that something like between 3 to 6% of GDP every year is added to the GDP of the imperialist countries through this surplus transfer taking place. So if there was no imperialist domination and international trade was fair, if you like, and there was no transfer of surplus value, then GDP in the major countries would be something like 5 or 6% lower than it is currently. My other general theoretical point I want to make about the post-pandemic period is that we're also in a period where globalization has come to an end. On the graph on the right, I'm measuring the US rate of profit, and I'm also measuring the level of international trade expansion and capital flows expansion, which has taken place in different periods. So that you can see when profitability is rising, as in this graph on the right. I don't know if it shows exactly. I can get, there we go. We can see that starting way back in the 1860s, we had a boom in capitalism generally. There was an increase in international trade and expansion, the blue shaded area. Then we had the long depression slump during the 1880s and 1890s in most of the major economies. And what this created was increased difficulty in profitability, but also it meant that the major capitalist powers now had to compete much more intensely against each other in order to gain profits around the world. So we got a process of protectionism, globalization, open trade became to an end, and we had eventually, in the case of the early part of the 20th century, a world war between the major imperialist powers. Then you can see we had the Great Depression of the 1930s and similar increased rivalry, which led to a Second World War in the 1940s. And if you move over further to the right, what I'm arguing for is we had a massive development of globalization in the period from the 1980s up until the end of the 20th century. Because profitability rose, it was possible to expand international trade and capital flows, and all the major powers were gaining from this through the exploitation of the rest of the world. But that came to an end in the Great Recession of 2008. Globalization has faded away. Now we're entering a period where the increased rivalry between the major imperialist powers as they desperately try to boost profitability at the expense of each other, not just at the expense of the global south. So you can see in this graph here, global trade to GDP sort of came an end in terms of growing. The trade ratio to total output in the world reached 60% in the 2008 period, but since then it's been declining. So we've now entered a period of declining globalization, of increased protection, of increased fragmentation of international trade and rivalry, a period which is very dangerous because it will lead to intense rivalry, not only economically, but also politically and militarily between the major imperialist powers or major powers in the world economy. That's the risk that comes from that period. It's another indication of the depressionary period we're in. So here's a measure from the IMF to show what would happen as free trade ends and we have completely fragmented global economy where trade is conducted through protectionism and through subsidies and not through trade agreements which allow both sides to trade. And you can see that you would see something like the breakdown of globalization could lead to a loss of 5% of GDP on the world where it would otherwise be, and the trade level reductions will be, of course, much greater. And alongside this, we've seen as because profitability has stayed low and depression has continued, there's been a massive increase in debt as companies and countries try to continue to grow by borrowing more. So throughout the period of the 2010s, we've seen a very sharp rise in global debt. In terms of dollars, it's now just around about 300 or more trillion dollars. And in terms of percentage of GDP, it's similarly very high indeed. This includes financial debt, but it's still a massive figure that you can see it's risen significantly in dollar terms from around 200 in 2015 to nearly, well, over 300 currently, and still more or less rising. That puts a tremendous burden on those countries that have big debts because they have to pay those debts back with interest. And if interest rises, as we can see, then that can add to the burden, particularly of those poor countries. And of course, this applies to companies within countries as well. But the weaker companies that have built up huge debts now face trying to service those debts, as it's called, given higher interest rates. And here's what's happening to the global south countries. The poorest ones, you can see a very sharp rise in what we call the debt service and interest payments on the debt that they owe to the countries in the imperialist bloc. And it's risen significantly from something like 30 billion in 2012 now to nearly 100 billion. in more than 10 years later. There's a massive increase then in the debt service burden for these countries, many of which are now being unable to pay. They're defaulting, as it's called, and are being forced to basically melt down their economies in such a situation, or turn to yet getting more borrowing with stringent conditions from the international agencies like the IMF and the World Bank. So I'd like to summarize where we are now after COVID in world capitalism in just covering a few areas. We can call it a polycrisis because some people are calling that there are a series of challenges or contradictions in capitalism have reached a head here in 2024. And these are the components of this polycrisis, a series of components coming together to form a major crisis for capitalism as we go into the rest of this decade. First, of course, there is global warming and the impact of pandemics. In other words, the destruction of the environment and nature by capitalism has caused a major problem for capitalism itself and, of course, the people, humanity itself and species in the world as a result of climate change and global warming. The global poverty is getting worse. Inequality is rising. I hope to present very briefly some evidence to support that. As I've mentioned already, economies are growing at a very slow rate. Debt is rising. The situation is deteriorating for large sections of the world and the poorest countries. And the end of globalization, the low levels of profitability, is forcing increased rivalry, not only on trade and economics, but also increasingly, dangerously, on political conflict and even military conflict with the increase of wars, as we've seen particularly in the last few years. And then perhaps the question of whether we're all going to lose our jobs if artificial intelligence, robots, machine learning takes over from humanity in producing things and services, but also whether that means perhaps a way out for capitalism or not. So let's just quickly remind ourselves of the situation on the climate change. We just had COP28, where there's an international meeting of all the countries to discuss how to try to keep a global warming down to no more than 1.5 degrees centigrade above the pre-industrial levels, and therefore control climate change over the rest of this century. They failed to reach any real agreement to do much about that. But we can see at the end of 2023, we're now at levels of really where the surface temperatures were worldwide around about 2%. We had the hottest year ever in 2023, and some of these months were the hottest ever recorded, and 2024 is unlikely to be any different. So we're now actually hitting 2% levels, if not all the time. We're certainly averaging very closely above the 1.5 limit that's set by the Paris Agreement back in 2015. And that's important, as I'll try to show, just to deal with the climate skeptics, climate warming skeptics who say that this is nothing unusual. We have periods of up and down. Yes, we have periods up and down in heat and cool over the last thousand years, but you can see that there's nothing like what has happened in the industrial period of the last century, where the temperature now on the world on average is up here somewhere, not round about here as we've seen in pre-industrial periods. So we have to, if we're going to get to 1.5 degrees centigrade, hopefully in a position to avoid the worst damage to the world, both humanity and the planet, as a result of global warming, then we have to get to net zero use in carbon dioxide emissions and other greenhouse gases. This is the trajectory required. This is where we are at the moment, 40 gigatons of carbon dioxide taking place in the world at the moment. You can see the faster rise since 1950. If we get to net zero and therefore keep to the 1.5 limit, we have to get down here, basically at 2030, very, very quickly. It's not happening. If we want to avoid the 1.7 level, then the trajectory isn't quite so sharp, but it's still very sharp to get to net zero. And if you just want to keep it to 2%, which will be 2 degrees above, which would be disastrous, then the trajectory is still huge. So there's a huge way for the world as a whole to get carbon emissions down to levels which would avoid disaster for billions of people across the world, from floods, excessive temperatures, droughts, and other hits, which would mean probably the emigration or the migration of millions and millions of people to other parts of the world. This is a disaster which is already beginning to happen. And at the moment, there is an inability of governments or unwillingness of governments and companies to do enough about this. Not only that challenge faces us in the next 10 years, maybe even less, but also we have to remind ourselves that capitalism remains an incredibly unequal sort of society. According to the various measures, this is one by Credit Suisse or UBS, last year, or 2022, 1% of adults, that's 59 million people out of just about 3.5 to 4 billion adults, 1% of these 59 million owed just about 45% of all the personal wealth in the world. Personal wealth, that's property, cash, stocks and shares, bonds, and so on, after debt. So we've taken into account debt. So this is a net position. So they own nearly 45%, the top 1%, a very small number of people. And down the bottom here, you can see that something like 50% of the world's population, or 2.8 million, own virtually nothing. Something like 1.2% of all the net wealth in the world. So the vast majority of people have no wealth and in fact are in debt. I always ask this question just to say to you guys, think about this. Where would you be in this pyramid? This is the top 1%, the 59 million people who've got most of the personal wealth. Do you think you're here in this 34%, this middle range? No, you're not. Anybody who's in an advanced capitalist economy, even if they really have nothing much at all in terms maybe a house or a home with a mortgage and some other savings, and that's about it, and their incomes as it comes in, you're actually in this block here. That shows how poor the rest of the world is as a result of the development of capitalism. So capitalism is supposed to be a system which will solve all the problems of human and social need better than previous systems. That's an argument that can take place, but clearly it's not doing that. Inequality remains huge, and if anything, it's getting worse. If you look at the right-hand scale here, this is a measure from the World Inequality Database. It shows that the top 0.01%, that's the really super rich, have had 8% of the world household wealth back in 1995. And now here we are some 30 years later, and they've increased that share by about 50% to 12%. So they own 12% of all the wealth in the world, just this very tiny number of people. Can't give you the exact measure here, but you can see, again, the top 1% is owning something like, in this measure, 30 to 40%, 40% of personal wealth. So inequality remains huge. The rich are getting richer and the poor are getting left behind. Nothing has really been done about that, of course. And as I said before, the increased divisions between the capitalist powers is creating a more multipolar world. The position of the United States is in relative decline. It's not true that it's disappeared. You can see that world trade is still mostly conducted in terms of the US dollar. Transactions by foreign exchange, 80% in the dollars, official reserves about 60% in dollars, trade invoicing about 50%. So the dollar remains the currency of exchange, trade, and investment, but it is relatively declining. More than that, we can see that some countries are beginning to close the gap with the imperialist powers, in particular China, who has dramatically improved its position in the world economy as a share of the total world economy in terms of output, trade, and so on. And that is creating a problem for US imperialism, that their position of more or less hegemonic and total dominance in the world economy and in the affairs of finance, military, and politics, has been in relative decline, and now it faces a severe rival in the world in the place of China. Just to give you an example of the positions on gross production in the world, you can see on the left, that's the G7, the top 7 capitalist economies, and you can see their decline in manufacturing production as a percentage of total output has been sharp since 1995. In the last 30 years, it's down from, US has dropped from 20% to about 12%. And who has replaced that in the share of gross output? It's China, rising from 5% to 35%, a truly stupendous increase in the share of world output. And on the right-hand side, you can see now that in terms of total output, China now produces more manufacturing goods as a percentage of output than the rest of the top 10 economies put together. So it's like a contrast between the economic strength of China's economy and the productive sectors compared to the military and financial strength of the US, whose military spending is more than any other country put together, all the other countries put together. So military prowess remains with the US, while economic and manufacturing prowess increasingly is with China. That's the danger of conflict that we're beginning to see over places like Taiwan and so on over the rest of this decade and beyond. Finally, let me just say about artificial intelligence. Will this be a game changer for capitalism in this decade? Because you could say that a huge increase in productivity of labor, reduction in the use of labor costs and wages would dramatically raise profitability for the major capitalist companies that introduce this around the world, and they would therefore be able to leap forward with a new boom for capitalism as a result. Would it take major economies out of their current long depression of low real GDP investment and income growth, and also enable the world to take strides out of poverty? Well, the first thing to say is that it's more likely to threaten the jobs of a whole range of people across the world. According to Goldman Sachs, they reckon that 2/3 of current occupations around the world could be partially automated by AI, and it could lead to the loss of 300 million jobs if fully implemented across the board, these new machine learning techniques in all parts of sectors of the economy. The question of whether that will happen or not is open to debate. So far, as somebody says, and we've got a lot of talk about artificial intelligence, about robots, about increases in technology as a result, but they don't show up in the stats in terms of increases in productivity yet. Insofar as there's an increase in productivity, it seems to be confined to the tech industries, which are increasing their productivity, but not spread across the world. But maybe that will change. According to Goldman Sachs, again, they could see a boost to annual productivity across the board by something like 1.5% a year over the next 10 years if it's fully adopted, AI is adopted across the world. So if you think that annual productivity growth on average at the moment in the world is around 2 or 3%, that's almost a doubling of the productivity growth, which would have a dramatic impact upon revenues for companies and therefore on profitability. But will that happen? That remains an open question, and in my view, it's not certain. What is clear is that it would only be achieved, this boost to profitability and perhaps a new period for capitalism, if millions of workers lose their jobs, have to go into different industries at lower rates of pay, and perhaps not even get back their jobs over the period of the next 10 to 15 years. So again, if capitalism is to get out of this polycrisis it's in, it can only do so at the expense of workers themselves. So I'll finish again on this graph, just to remind you that the theoretical point here is that what drives capitalism is profitability. If profitability is rising, then capitalism is progressing. Production increases, investment increases, and an expansion of trade. It appears that there's an improvement of a lot of those working in capitalist economies, although of course not in equally. The rich gains mostly from this. But there are periods when capitalism does appear to recover, as in the neoliberal period, of the 1980s and beyond. But since in this 21st century, as we enter the third decade, we remain in a long depression. These little S's are where we have slumps, but you can see the trend trajectory of global profitability remains poor and falling still. So unless something dramatic happens in order to regain a level of profitability that goes upwards again, a new period of recovery, capitalism remains in the doldrums, and its inability will be to solve these crises that I've described to you in this presentation. Thank you.
Bravo, thank you, Michael. Listen, I really appreciate everything you've gone through. I just want to give a bit of background as well in terms of how I actually came into contact with you, because I've been reading your blog, and I've put the blog in the chat for a few years now. It was actually during the crisis. It was probably the website I was checking during COVID. It was probably the website I was checking daily, because I felt very I felt like everything was very opaque and I couldn't understand what I was sort of reading in the news, especially economically. And I thought that your writings on it prior to and then during the COVID lockdowns was very clarifying, I think. And then that was also during the time that I first attempted reading Capital. So it was nice to have that kind of mix of reading Marx sort of, as he wrote it, and then you putting it into context in the sort of current situation. Like I remember you were saying at the end of 2019 that the world economy was entering some type of crisis, and I saw that explicitly because I was working for a company that sold commodities, and we were losing profits all the way towards the back end of the 2019. So yeah, I would encourage everyone to read Michael's blog. It's very clarifying. I think when you read the news and you compare it to what Michael writes, I think it helps put a lot of things into context, and it helps demystify some of the bullshit that you can get sort of from legacy media, legacy economists, and so on. So yeah, I always really appreciate your work and encourage people to read it. I'm gonna, like I said at the start, I'm gonna take my tyrannical authority here and ask a few questions. But before I do, I think the easiest way to get people to involved in the question time is here. Like I said, if you can put your name in the chat or just say message request, and we can just address you that way, because I can't see everyone in the screen, so I can't address people who put their hand up in the Zoom. So it'll just be much easier. I was just clapping. Thanks, Jack. So yeah, if you can put your name or just say message request in the chat, that will be ideal, and I can just sort of scroll through and catch you that way. And then if you just want to ask the question explicitly through the chat, just put it in there, and we'll address it as it comes through. So I hope that's clear for everyone. I've also put in the chat just the email addresses for the various affiliations, Wellington, Canterbury, Otago. So if you're not a member already and you want to reach out, by all means. So the first question, I had a few questions written down, but now in reflection, I mean, the reason why in the beginning I stole a quote from Engels that you put in your book in Capital in the 21st Century was nature is man's inorganic body, and that was the very first chapter in your book. I did want to, it's a little cheeky question by me, sort of not related to the content, but I just wanted to ask you, can you explain to people in the event here tonight how you conceive of Marx and Engels' sort of relationship to ecology, and possibly break down a bit the kind of split that happened in the 20th century between the sort of Promethean Marx and Engels and the romantic Marx, and especially, the Promethean Engels more so, but the romantic Marx, why that split happened in the first place? Because you put it out beautifully, I think, that there is no split between the romanticism and the sort of Prometheanism of Marx, and they understand that humans are, integrally tied to nature, like we are a part of it, not a synthetic aberration of it.
Yes, Wayne, I think this is a bit of a big debate amongst socialists and Marxists at the moment, or perhaps the Marxists are debating whether Marx was just interested in growth and measuring, as I've just done now, the expansion of the economy in terms of GDP or other measures that capitalist economists use to measure growth in the economy, and had no inclination or feeling about how this would impact upon not only nature in general, the planet, the planet itself and other species and so on, and that merely was interested in how that would improve the conditions for humanity, and that the level of increase in labor productivity was the key to understanding whether things were getting better, and what happened to nature was irrelevant, and nature was just there to be used by humanity. Now, that is a view which probably is, my view, probably more likely to be one of the view of capital, really, as far as they're concerned. But there is an argument that Marx and Engels just saw things in the same way, and that therefore they didn't take into account the huge damage that's happening to the planet, which we're now so much aware of when it comes to climate change, global warming, pandemics as a result of the expansion of human and activity and industrialization into remote parts of the world, opening up for pathogens that have got into the world, industrial farming, food adulteration. This is all part of the process by which we've had and will get more pandemics. But if we look at Marx's and Engels' works, I think we argue in the book, and other people have argued as well, that's not the case. They were aware that it wasn't just a question of inequalities between human beings, it wasn't just of the exploitation of labor by capital, but also the destruction of the environment and nature by capital as a result of their incessant drive to increase profit. And there's lots of readings that have been brought to our attention again of Marx and Engels' writings that show just that. The question, I suppose, just to add a little bit about a certain debate that is going on at the moment. I don't know if you know about Kohei Saito. Kohei Saito is a Japanese Marxist, sociologist. He's written a book which had a huge impact in Japan, sorry. 500,000 people have read the book, in which he says that this is the destruction of the planet's taking place because of capitalism, and we must therefore end the growth of production in order to restore a balance between humanity and nature and save nature. So it raises the question of so-called degrowth. Is the solution to this issue of the destruction of the nature and environment by capital to be solved by stopping growth, or is it can be solved in other ways rather than doing that? And is that the question that faces people at the moment? These are matters of debate which are taking place. But I think short answer to your question is that it's not true that Marx and Engels only saw production and growth and the contradictions in production under capitalism as the only thing that we have to look at, and socialism is about increasing production and increasing output of services and things that people need. It is also, they were also very clear that it was a question of harmonious increase in meeting the social needs, not just of humanity, but also integrating it into saving the species and integrating ourselves into a connection between nature and the rest of the planet.
Yeah, thanks, Michael, for indulging me in that, because it often feels like, some people just read what Marx says in something like the manifesto, and then it's like, that's it, the productive powers of capitalism, greatest thing in humanity. And then people read the economic manuscripts and it's like, oh, but it's all about alienation, and it's like it's the same guy writing the stuff,
Obviously, they changed their views in that period of talk about alienation and the economic and philosophical manuscripts written in 1844, Capital written in or published at least in 1867, and writings about nature and the planet, which Engels and Marx engaged in, particularly in Anti-Turing and Socialism, Utopia and Scientific by Engels, which was work coordinated with Marx in 1881. They changed their views. They developed some of these things which they hadn't developed, of course, in the early days of the 1840s. The other one, big one for people aware, is their development of the view of the nature of imperialism, which wasn't really thought about except in terms of colonial suppression in the 1840s. By the 1880s, they were aware of the imperialist exploitation of labor, and they began to bring that into their discussions of the nature of capitalism then.
Beautiful. All right. So the first question on the list, Tom, take it away, my friend.
Cool, thank you. Thank you for the talk, Michael. That was really great. I wanted to ask you, because I recall reading probably 6 months ago in the Weekly Worker while I was at work, which perhaps suggests that my job is one of those ones that's threat by AI, that I can spend a bit of time reading the Weekly Worker while I'm there. But I can't recall if it was actually you or if it was Jack Conrad or Mike McNair, but it was a discussion around what GDP actually measures versus, the limitations of what GDP is actually measuring. Because I guess my understanding from those discussions was that it is measuring exchange of various values and stuff, but it's not necessarily measuring what we could consider productivity of actual goods or anything like that. And could be a bit of a misleading measure. Could you sort of just give a good description of what does GDP actually measure, what are its uses, and then its limitations in terms of measurement of the economy?
Well, gross domestic product, that's what we mean by is the initials for GDP. You could have, if we break that down a bit, product. So it's measuring production. What do we mean by production? Well, in the case of capitalism, it means trying to count up all the goods and services produced and put a monetary value to them in some way, whether it's in dollars, one currency, or other currencies, so that we can estimate the total amount of output of goods and services in the world being produced. Domestic simply means, well, let's refer to one country. We're not referring necessarily to the whole world, but we're also referring to a country without anything to do with the trade or transfers of incomes between countries, just looking at the production of goods and services in money terms in that particular area. If it's one country, or when you get to the whole world, of course, that will include trade, but then it's domestic as well. And then gross means that it's looking at the total amount of production of goods and services. It's not taking into account what costs there are in producing that, and therefore breaking it down to levels of how much profit is being made, how much is going in terms of wages, how much is having to be kept back to reproduce the existing production facilities in terms of replacing old equipment and so on. So it's a measure which is all-encompassing about production and services. And capitalist economists in the mid-40s, Simon Kuznets, developed this idea, because up to then, capitalist companies and governments didn't have really an idea of how much there was production going on in the world, and they thought this would be useful because it would tell them whether the capitalist economies are doing well or not. They needed to have a measure of how the health of the economies were going forward. So they used GDP, domestic production, as measured in money terms of productions and services. How do you measure in money terms services and goods? Well, it's a complicated process done by statistical institutes that try to work out what the value of each individual commodity is and connect it all into one big economic figure. It's full of holes, of course, in terms of working out whether it's accurate or not. But perhaps the question for us as socialists is that, is the increase in production of goods and services anything to do with human welfare? Is that really the same thing? And of course, there's big debate, and it's clearly not the case that looking at whether there's changes in GDP. So if GDP goes up 10% in a year for the world or for a country, does that mean that everything's been improved by 10% for the people, the humanity in that country? Or for that matter, the other species and the planet in that country? No, because GDP doesn't take into account the damage to environment. There's no measure of the damage to environment caused by an increase in production. So if you increase production in steel or oil, the carbon emissions, there's no measure of the damage to that caused by the increase in oil production. It's also, remember, GDP includes an increase in military spending. So more bombs are being produced to bomb Gaza or wherever it is, that's an increase in GDP. Now, you might say, well, that's hardly an increase in human welfare. So GDP is not a measure of human welfare. It's not a measure that we would want to use in a socialist society to say how things are. But it's a very useful measure for capitalism. That's the point to remember, that when people hear arguments amongst socialists and Marxists, we should do away with GDP. Well, yeah, but that doesn't, if we do away with GDP, we lose a major measure of how capitalism is doing and how capitalists see themselves doing something. So the presentation I've made to you is full of GDP figures and so on. And you could easily come back and say, well, what about welfare? What about nature? What about the environment? What about happiness? And what about all the things that you've included in GDP that we shouldn't include in GDP if we are really looking at it from a socialist or point of view of labour, like military, like advertising, like gaming, and all these things are part of GDP, which we wouldn't see as part of human welfare. But that's not seeing it from the point of view of capital. And it is necessary for us to look from the point of view of capital in order to understand the processes taking place in capitalism itself. Still not a very good measure, even for capital.
Measure something though, as you rightly point out. Next person I've got on the list, TJ. You still there?
Yep. Yeah,
Cool.
I'm still here.
You
Yeah, kia ora, Michael, and thanks for a quite enlivening talk. I'll try and keep my question fairly short. What I'm interested in here is the relationship between what we might call the COVID and post-COVID economy and the general drive of militarism we're seeing at the moment, whether or not the capitalists necessarily want there to be a major war at the moment. It seems that we're going to get something like that anyway, and the Pacific looks like it could easily be a theatre in any future economic war, which of course concerns us here in New Zealand greatly. But I was wondering if you could speak to the relationship that there might be between how the economy was affected and changed as a result of the pandemic and the almost immediate outbreak of first a very major conflict in Europe, but also major conflicts in other parts of the world as well.
Yeah, well, I think as I tried to argue that what we've seen since the end of the pandemic is not a recovery in capitalism, a sharp recovery in GDP growth, in investment, and therefore in the ability of capitalism to, as it were, gain profits, not at the expense of each other, but generally through the better exploitation of labour. That hasn't happened. We've got generally a stagnating world economy where growth rates at best for the whole world, and that includes China and India, which are some of the fastest growing, biggest economies, of something like 3% this year, maybe less. That's very low for the world economy's GDP growth. And then if we look at the advanced economies, growth rates are way lower than that. The US is the best performing major advanced capitalist economy, and this year, in 2023, it will have grown around about 2.5%. But Europe as a whole will be virtually flat. In the case of the UK, Germany, France, 0 is the growth rate in 2023, if not actually have fallen. New Zealand is actually in recession. It's had 2 quarters of slump. So it's a tiny capitalist economy dependent on the rest of the world and so on for exports. And it's suffering badly as a result of this stagnation. So across the board, the major economies of capitalism within so-called OECD economies are stagnating at best, and likely during this year, many of them to enter recession. So in that situation, there's increased rivalry between the capitalist powers about how can they improve their position in the world. And I showed those figures of the declining globalization, the expansion of international trade and capital investment, which will enable all countries in the capitalist world to gain at the expense of labor. That's now become an increasing battle between the major capitalist powers. And the big geopolitical rivalry is developing, of course, between the US and its allies, and those capitalist powers or economic powers that are not prepared to toe the line with American imperialism. It seems that the European leaders have been prepared to kowtow to anything the US imperialism wants, but there are many countries in the world that try to go on an independent line, to build their own position and their own economic and political strength. That is a threat to US imperialism and its economic position, and to an imperialist bloc in general. And of course, as we've seen in the case of, first of all, in the recent period, we go back to the beginning of this century, that we have to remind ourselves of the Iraq and Afghan battles, which are the result of American imperialism trying to impose its will over the Middle East and Asia, which continued for more than a decade and a half before they finally gave up on that one. Then, of course, now the Russian invasion of Ukraine in response to the increasing encroachment of NATO into areas which the Russian capitalist power sees as its sphere of influence. They weren't prepared to let that happen. And so we now have this grinding war with 500,000 people being killed on each side, which continues into this year and maybe beyond. And then the horrendous position we see in Israel and Gaza as a result of the attempts of the Palestinian people to break out of their prison, and the response of the Israeli government, backed by imperialism to the hilt, to crush any opposition within Palestine, and not just opposition, but people and everybody. That situation continues, but as you say, we have perhaps the biggest theatre of geopolitical rivalry is going to be in Asia, in the Pacific theatre, because China is the major threat to US imperialism, both in technology, on trade, manufacturing. And what they fear, of course, increasingly, is the ability of China to exert its influence over its neighboring countries in the region in terms of providing funds and credit and financial support, which imperialism is unable or unwilling to do for the poorest countries in the Asian area. And China's influence regionally grows. This has got to be suppressed. China has not only got to be curbed, it's basically got to be reversed. They want to see the end of this highly successful economy, which threatens US dominance during the rest of this century. Pax Americana is over. That lasted from 1950 to the 1990s. Now we enter a period where there is competing powers. And if we go to the 21st century, the danger for American imperialism, it will be not they who will be in charge for the rest of this century. And that leads us to the major conflict between China and the US. Will this end up in military conflict? Well, I don't know for sure, but what is clear that the Americans are trying to provoke such a situation by introducing huge amounts of military bases surrounding China in various parts of the Pacific, and in particular bolstering the small Taiwanese economy as a provocation to China. From their point of view, the Chinese regime considers Taiwan always been part of China, and the only reason they don't have it as part of China is because American imperialism ensured from the very beginning in 1949 that it would not be part of China in a de facto sense. But I don't know. I think you're right. I think the possibilities of military conflict in the Asia-Pacific area are increasing by the year as a result of the difficulties economically that US imperialism and its allies face over the next period, and the challenge provided by China and other recalcitrant powers like Russia, but mostly China.
Nice. Well, not nice. Next up, is it apologies if I pronounce your name wrong, my friend. Is it Burke?
Yeah, that's
still there,
quite
bud?
good pronunciation. Yeah.
Thank you, brother.
Good. Firstly, thank you, Michael. It was really a great overview. My question is regarding the new debates on the periodization of capitalism in the post-pandemic era. So around early last year, economic historian Robert Brenner and Dylan Riley sparked a new debate in the New Left Review, and they coined the term political capitalism to define the post-pandemic era tendencies, and they outline certain characteristics such as slow growth, a potential reinvestment to the productive classes globally to offset the pandemic-related destruction, maybe a return to industrial policy and increasing monopoly of the capitalist class on politics. And some similarize this debate, some similarize this concept as a new feudal system, new feudal regime. And there were other debates similar to this. They were coining the terms like neo-feudalism, techno-feudalism, trying to attract attention to the fact that what we see today as Bidenomics or Bidenism, which is an interesting reorganization, if you ask me. And I was curious about what you think about that. Do you, as Göraner argues, believe that we need to define an era of capitalism characterized by these distinct tendencies, potentially introducing new models of capital accumulation? And is it something very different from neoliberalism, which we're supposed to recognize after 45, 50 years of imposition of it? Thank you.
Very good question, Berke. It's a complicated one. As you've outlined, there are lots of different views about what period we are in the 21st century, where capitalism, has it changed its spots? Has the leopard changed its spots? I've never been a great fan of this changing of spots idea for capitalism, or the idea that we have suddenly some sort of new stage of capitalism that is fundamentally different from the classical process of accumulation of profit and exploitation of labor, of which capitalism is the mode of production operating for the last 200 years or so. Yes, there are periods. This is why I prefer to relate everything to what's happening with the profitability of capital in a world scale and in the major economies. And when we have the neoliberal period is a period when capitalism tried to restore a low level of profitability, reverse that process which happened during the 1970s, and they managed through the process of privatization, of the destruction of trade unions, of serious manufacturing recession, globalization shifting industry to the so-called third world at the time, deregulation of the economy, financial expansion, and so on. All these methods raised the profitability to some extent for the major economies during the period from the early 1980s to the end of the 20th century. I don't think that changed the nature of capitalism. It was still operating. It's just that there was they took steps to try and raise the profitability, which was relatively successful for a while, but it didn't really transform the position for capitalism, because the law of profitability, which I put in my presentation that Marx outlined, begins to exert its pressure. And from throughout the 21st century, we've seen a fall in global profitability at worst, and certainly no more than a stagnation at best for the major economies. So this increases the difficulty for capitalism to expand investment, and increases the rivalry, which we talked about, between imperialist powers. I don't see that as a change in the nature of capitalism. And there's a few people, I don't know if, I think the New Left Review is one of them, other Marxist economists, so-called Marxist economists like Varoufakis, has a book out which he has headlined The End of Capitalism. What does he mean by that? He says, well, capitalism's now changed. It's no longer capitalism as we understand it, of capitalist companies competing against each other to boost profitability, and exploit workers better. Now we just have what he calls feudalism, feudal capitalism. Basically, there's a few monopolies. They control everything. They extract rents, not profit, from the rest of the world. And that this is a different system. Capitalism has disappeared. Well, that worries me when you say that, because it implies in some way that if we could only get capitalism back, things would be better. Let's get back from feudalism to capitalism and things will improve. Well, no. I think this is a distortion of what's happening. But what we've got is this stage of capitalism, if you want to call it a stage, situation where capitalism's facing very low profitability. It's unable to change that. It's a depressionary, stagnationary situation, which is increasing rivalry between the various capitalist powers. I think that's a simpler understanding of what's going on, and we don't need to invent techno-feudalism or financialization or all the other phrases that many academic Marxists like to think, because they want like to come up, am I being unfair here? They want to come up with something that's different that makes them look good. That's really nasty of me, isn't it? But I just think that we should stick to the classical understanding of the capitalist mode of production that Marx outlined in Capital in 1867. I don't think it's changed. I think we can use that as the basis of our understanding. The leopards have not changed their spots. It's just that the leopards are a little bit slower in moving than they were in other periods. So that's the way I would look at it. But it's a continual debate, an argument that academic Marxists like to have. I'm being nasty again.
Michael, I'm sure more nastier things have been said in academia than what you just said. It was, I'm sure it was almost polite for that world. But yeah, Berkeley, great question, mate. I really appreciate you bringing that up, because to some degree it was an elephant in the room. And I worry now because Angus has got his next question, or the question that is next. It may have been something similar, but Angus, if you're still there, mate, come on in.
Thanks, Hayden. No, my question is actually going to be about inflation. And thanks, Michael, as well. That was a really great talk. Somewhat selfish question on me, because I actually work for the National Statistics Agency in New Zealand here. I know you took some pot shots.
Oh, you're all to blame for this then, are you?
You took some pot shots at GDP there earlier, but I'll let that slide, and I definitely agree. I should probably say, I guess, that I speaking on behalf of myself and not my agency, but you laid out, I guess, when you're talking about inflation, the orthodox response that wages were driving inflation, and then you took a look at profits. There was also a response from, I guess, what we might call like post-Keynesians or neo-Keynesians, so Isabella Weber, these people really leaning into that profit-driven inflation. And I know you have a critique of that as well. I wonder if you could lay out that for us briefly, because it has been taken up quite a bit on maybe not, if not the Marxist left, I guess in the broader social democratic left, and trade unions, especially the trade union, the national trade union body here was part of publishing a fairly big report that looked at this profit-driven inflation phenomenon. So yeah, wondering if you could explain that, and then maybe just crystal ball gaze a little bit on the inflation outlook. Could, given what you've laid out with the end of globalization, increasing imperialist rivalry, are we going to get back to 2%? Can we fringe shore back to 2%, or are we going to be stuck on the last hurdle?
Yeah. Well, first of all, the question of profits or wages causing inflation. As I said, of course, the authorities generally have, if they've looked at the question to begin with, they wanted to push the idea of excessive demand, too much government spending, or money supply was too strong, or eventually it was workers asking for wages, causing labour costs to rise and forcing companies to raise prices. Over the period of time, even they couldn't really hold to any of those positions, because evidence came through to clarify the picture that it was clearly a supply side issue here, of supply chain blockages on international trade in general, poor recovery in manufacturing output, low productivity growth. Many workers didn't go back to work for all sorts of different reasons, or they didn't move into areas which were going to boost productivity sufficiently. Investment wasn't there. So it was a supply issue rather than a demand issue. Of course, inflation, if you want to, prices rise because of a relationship between demand and supply. So it's always two sides. So it's, if you want to look at it that way. But clearly, if we look at this picture, we can see that it was a relative decline in supply development compared to demand development. That was the key factor, and lots of studies have done that, and both the IMF and all the other institutions generally admit to this point of view. One of the things that came from what you might call the post-Keynes on the left was that this was more than just a supply blockage, it was also a profit-driven inflation situation, which to some extent is obviously true, but we have a phrase developed called greed inflation, that capitalists were being greedy. And this always seems rather an uneconomic or precise way of putting it. That capitalism is always greedy in that sense, it seems to me, that it wishes to maximize its profit levels, its margins, and its general profit if it can. And what I think a lot of evidence has now shown, it's not so much that they were specifically greedy in this situation, that where you had an increase in supply production costs, capitalists looked to compensate for that by raising prices, necessarily to try and maintain their margins. And in the case of, certainly in certain sectors, they were able to increase their margins and their profits because they had such a monopoly control over those sectors, food and energy, I mentioned it before. But if you look at the general position of companies across the board in the major economies, basically they were, if you like, their prices were chasing increasing costs forced by these supply pressures. So they tried to maintain their margins and so on. Actually, during 2022 onwards into 2023, margins have been falling. So they haven't been able to sustain that. And we've seen a change in that argument. So it's not just now you could say, well, that means that's how inflation has fallen. Well, inflation has also fallen because supply has picked up and supply blockages have broken down. So costs are not rising quite as fast as they were before. And so we get, and margins have been squeezed a bit as well. Combination coming together means that we've seen a fall in inflation, halving of inflation rates approximately in the major economies. Will they get down to 2%? Well, my view is that the only, it's a matter of debate, because amongst the conventional economists, you've had this debate that inflation has fallen. Inflation was always transitory. It was going to come down anyway. And in a sense, that was true because it was to do with supply blockages. But fundamentally, inflation is also due to the ability to raise productivity of labor sufficiently to achieve growth in incomes, profits and wages without having to raise prices. That requires keeping unit costs down, an increase in unit costs, and that means a sharp increase in the productivity of labor, which we haven't really seen. So it seems to me that there's every possibility, if we stay in this relatively stagnatory position, given the fact that supply chains are also still not completely clear, and there's a danger that they could rise again, that inflation may drop further in some of the major economies, but I can't see it getting back to that 2% level. This is of interest to mainstream economists, central bankers, about whether they get their 2% rate, the last mile, as they call it. But clearly, I think we're into a period where inflation will be a bit higher than it used to be in the past, unless we see a dramatic increase in the productivity of labor over the next decade. The only way I think we will get down to 2% or below is if we go into a slump. Then you could see a sharp drop in spending, of obviously both investment and employment spending, and then you could see a slump will take inflation right down, possibly into deflationary areas. That's a possibility. But what do we learn from all that? I don't like the idea of greedy inflation. I don't like the idea that it's just profits. I think it's a question of understanding the process of the relationship between supply and demand, and in particularly unit costs and the development of the productivity of labor. And fundamentally, as my Carcadi and I are developing a new theory of inflation, we want to look, what do we mean by that? We want to look at what is happening to the growth in value, which by we mean the labor hours, the level of production of labor hours into the economies, because if the number of hours falls to produce the same amount of output, then generally there's a downward pressure on prices. That's what it means. And so faster growth in productivity, which means less labor hours being used to produce the same thing, would tend to lower inflation over a period of time. And that remains the key as far as we're concerned to see where inflation is going. There was one question on, do we consider the G7 imperialist powers? Yes, I do. But they're not the only imperialist powers. There's a few smaller ones to go with them. I think we could talk about a block of 13 or so countries. What do we count New Zealand in there? Well, yeah, but they're not much of a an imperialist power. They're really a subordinate power within the imperialist bloc, as is Australia. That was one other question. Could New Zealand be drawn into the conflict?
Sorry, well, I just had a bit of a problem with my mouse there, but I think just in the case of time, I don't want to keep you too much longer, Michael, nor everyone else, because it is getting late back home. There is one more question. Joe, do you mind?
Yeah, no, thank you. Great. No, thank you for your talk, Michael. It was really, really, really good. I guess I was quite interested in what you were saying about globalization and things, because I think it tailors into that whole thing of capitalism is always predicting that the good times are always around the corner. It always sort of hypes itself up. And just to make, and it sort of it reminded me of some of the work of people like Robert Wade and that have been done work on globalization, is that I just to make a link between maybe two of your slides there. I just thought it was interesting, say, if you go back to the period about 1912 to 1950, that was a period when there was a lot of trade protectionism, and that was all happening at that time. But at that same time, you also had that huge increases in communication technology. So virtually went from the telegraph right up to satellite phones. So if in the position of sort of 1912, would a capitalist be sort of saying, well, look what's happening. We're going to be great. It's going to happen. So I guess it sort of was, I wondered if that would make whether you could relate that situation to what's happening with AI, and just to say whether you think AI is going to be overestimating its impact as a positive sense, or is it going to be like the communication technology overreach from 1912?
I think it's very good, Joe. It's exactly the question I'm not sure we can answer. But after the end of the First World War, we had the Spanish flu epidemic, which millions died. So they had the sort of a pandemic, and then we had a period in the 20s, at least in some countries, where you had a boom. The United States being one. It was called the Roaring 20s. There are some mainstream economists who say that we're about to enter the Roaring 20s again, although I notice we're in 2024 already, so maybe that's not going to be happening so as quickly as they thought. But the argument is exactly as you put it, that there was loads of technological innovations developed, particularly in the 20s and 30s, most of which were not really employed or deployed until after the Second World War, when we saw the boom then. But depressions don't mean that innovation doesn't continue, and a lot of things are developed. Whether they're actually applied by capitalism depends on whether they're profitable to them, and they have to see that they can use them. And it's a chicken and egg argument. Do they need higher profitability first before they start investing in new technology, or do they need new technology to raise their profitability in the exploitation of labor? It's a bit of a difficult one to answer which way it would go. But I would, if I'm asked to answer it, I would say in the 2024 now, we have new technologies that are being invented, not just AI, but in all kinds of other areas, in biological areas and nano production and so on. Chips are being reduced dramatically to nothing. There are tremendous possibilities for reducing the labor time involved in producing things, and therefore the productivity of labor, reducing costs in that way for capitalism ought to lead to a massive increase in profitability and enable them to expand and have a roaring 2020s to match the 1920s, at least for the US. But at the moment, we don't see it. We don't see it. These haven't been applied. Profitability remains low. I suspect that we require a severe slump first to create the conditions for higher profitability for those that are left before these new measures can be applied by companies to make huge profits. Maybe not, but that's, I think, the possibility that we'd have to look at rather. So we need another little, I don't know if you saw my last graph when I had the little S's on it, which are the slumps. Maybe we need another one of those big S's like we've just had already before capitalism could start using these things profitably and enter a new boom. But a lot of other things could cut across that in the meantime, as we just discussed.
That's very good. Because it's also, you can talk about the Roaring 1920s too. It was very uneven across the world. So you had like America doing well, but the UK and New Zealand were actually not doing well at all.
UK was a disaster. That was the end of the UK's capitalism, really, in the 20s.
Yeah, the gold standard.
Depression. the irony is that the UK did a bit better in the 1930s, while the US did terribly. So it's not synchronized always.
No, thank you.
Thanks for that, Joe. Listen, I am aware of the time. I do see there's a couple of questions in there, but what I propose, if you do send those questions you have to myself, I'm more than happy to pass them on to Michael, and if he is free at some point, he could get back to you. Can't make promises on his behalf, but that's my solution at this point. But yeah, listen, thank you everyone for coming tonight, members and people who are friends of the society, the Federation. It's good to see you all. Michael, really appreciate your time. But before you do go, do let us know. I'll share a couple of things in the chat of where we can find your works from the Weekly Worker and your blog. But is there anything else you're up to at the moment? Is there any other ways people can find out works that you've been up to, things you've done, where they can get a hold of your work?
Well, my Facebook site, which is pretty obvious, Michael Roberts blog on Facebook. If you haven't followed that, then you can at least keep up to what I'm thinking about almost on a daily basis. I am on Twitter, but nobody really looks at my Twitter site, and I'm not sure I've got enough moaning to do on a daily basis to use Twitter. And then I also have a YouTube channel like you guys. So some of these discussions, interviews, seminars that I've done in the past, presentations are on that YouTube channel. Again, it's Michael Roberts blog YouTube. So that may have some use to you if you like the visual and the talk. I struggle. I have the attention of a newt. So normally after about 2 minutes, I just want to go and read something. But that's me.
Nice, thank you, Michael. And listen, if you ever are in New Zealand, obviously make contact with any of the team down there from the Federation. And next time you're in the city of London, I work on Fenchurch Street, so by all means, give me a shout. Love to catch up for a coffee sometime.
That'd be great. Thanks a lot, and thanks everybody.
I'll get some of the team to send me more copies of this, and I'll pass it on to you when it arrives.
Well, thanks everybody for inviting me, and you can all get ready to relax now with a few drinks before bed. I have to start the day.
Thanks, Mike.
Thank you,
Take
Michael.
it easy. See you, everyone.
Right.
Mm-hmm.